Moscow, July 17, 1944. The city that once trembled under the shadow of the Wehrmacht now stands in eerie silence. A grey sky hangs over the capital, heavy with anticipation. The rain has stopped, but puddles glisten on the cobblestone streets, mirroring the faces of thousands who've gathered along Gorky Street. From balconies, rooftops, and open windows, Soviet citizens lean forward, waiting. They have seen tanks burn, cities fall, and families vanish in war's cruel furnace. But today, they will witness something no one thought possible. The faint sound of boots begins to echo, a rhythmic, mechanical stomp that grows louder with every second. Then, through the mist, they appear. Thousands of captured German soldiers. The once proud conquerors of Europe now walk broken and defeated through the heart of the Soviet Union. No music plays, no cheers erupt. Only the hollow sound of wet boots against the stone, a grim symphony of humiliation. Women stare in silence. Children whisper questions their mothers cannot answer. And in the distance, the Kremlin towers loom over the parade. The silent reminder of power reclaimed, of vengeance complete. Stalin's message to the world is clear: the invincible have fallen. This is not a celebration. It's a reckoning. A march not of victory, but of shame. This is Stalin's parade of Nazi prisoners. The march stretched for hours, a river of broken men flowing through the heart of Moscow. More than 57,000 German prisoners, once soldiers of the most feared army in the world, now shuffled under the grey July sky of 1944. The city that had endured hunger, siege, and loss stood in stunned silence. The very streets that had once shaken under the bombs of the Luftwaffe now trembled with the footsteps of the defeated. It was a sight that many Muscovites had prayed to see, but never truly believed they would. The rain had turned the cobblestones slick and shining, the puddles reflecting 1,000 ghostly faces as the procession moved slowly forward, one wary step after another. They were not the same men who had once shouted victory cries in Berlin. Their uniforms, once immaculate, hung from their bodies like rags. Torn, mud-stained. Stripped of medals and insignia, they were ghosts of the empire that had sought to destroy everything in its path. The once proud eagles on their caps were gone, the symbols of their reich now meaningless beneath the leaden sky of their enemy's capital. Their faces were pale, hollow, and unshaven, each pair of eyes telling a story of hunger, exhaustion, and disbelief. Some limped, others clutched at their sides, still wounded, barely able to keep up with the endless column. Yet none dared fall. Soviet guards lined the route, rifles in hand, their expressions frozen in stoic watchfulness. Along the sidewalks, thousands of Soviet citizens gathered, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Old men with medals pinned to worn coats, women in scarves holding small children close, workers still in factory uniforms smeared with grease and soot, all of them watching. Many had lost someone, a husband, a son, a brother. Some had buried their dead in the snow just a few years before, when the Germans had pushed to the gates of the city. Now, they stared as those same invaders passed before them, humbled and broken. Some faces showed pride, others rage, yet most simply watched in silence, their emotions too deep, too mixed to express. Every so often, a prisoner would glance toward the crowd. He would see not hatred, but something colder, indifference, the kind of silence that carried judgment more powerful than any shout. The Soviets had been told not to throw stones, not to curse, not to interfere. This was not to be a mob's vengeance, but the state's message. Stalin wanted dignity, control, and spectacle. And so, the crowd obeyed. The only sounds were the scuff of boots, the soft patter of rain, and the occasional caw of a crow echoing through the still air. The marchers stretched farther than the eye could see. Down Gorky Street, past the imposing facades of war-scarred buildings, they moved like a grey serpent winding its way through the heart of victory. The smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies filled the air. Mud splashed up with every step. The rhythm was relentless, mechanical, almost hypnotic. It was said that even the wind seemed to pause, unwilling to disturb the eerie procession. The city watched in collective stillness as the once mighty soldiers of Hitler's army trudged toward their fate. In the front ranks were the officers, men who had once commanded entire divisions, now stripped of insignia, forced to walk with the same blank despair as their men. Some still tried to keep their posture straight, their eyes fixed forward, clinging to fragments of dignity. But the weight of defeat bent their shoulders. Behind them, columns of ordinary soldiers followed. Infantrymen, tank drivers, gunners, their faces smeared with dirt, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights and endless hunger. A few stumbled, their legs shaking beneath them, and were pushed forward by the current of bodies. There was no stopping, no rest. A small child in the crowd, no older than 6, pointed at the passing men and whispered to his mother. She did not answer. How could she explain? These were the men who had burned villages, who had turned homes into ashes, but now they looked no more dangerous than beggars. The boy fell silent, clutching the edge of his mother's shawl as the prisoners shuffled past, each one another ghost from a nightmare that was finally ending. For some in the crowd, the sight brought no joy. An old woman crossed herself quietly, murmuring a prayer. She remembered the winter of 1941, when her son had gone to the front and never returned. She had cursed the Germans then, cursed their machines and their arrogance. But now, seeing them so defeated, she felt no triumph, only emptiness. What could victory mean when so many graves lined the land? The men before her were not symbols of glory or vengeance. They were the living evidence of a world gone mad, paying its debt in flesh and misery. As the hours passed, the air grew thick with fatigue. Even the spectators began to feel the weight of it. The endless faces, the monotonous march, the greyness of it all. It was as though time itself had slowed. Yet beneath the monotony was something electric, something powerful. The spectacle was not meant to entertain, but to burn an image into memory. Stalin wanted his people to see this and never forget. The message was simple. Those who bring war to Russia will one day walk its streets in chains. For the prisoners, every step was humiliation. Some clenched their jaws, others stared at the ground. The mud clung to their boots, the rain to their faces, as they marched past red Soviet banners that flapped in the wind. The city seemed to close in on them, its walls watching silently, its people the jury of history. They had marched through Paris, Warsaw, Kiev, Minsk, each city conquered, humiliated, left in ruins. But Moscow stood tall. Moscow had survived, and now Moscow was their prison. An interpreter among the guards overheard some of the Germans whispering. They spoke of disbelief, that they were still alive, that they were being paraded like animals instead of executed. Some muttered prayers, others cursed under their breath. But none dared break formation. They knew that any sign of resistance could end with a single gunshot, and so they endured the endless walk, each step taking them farther from home, deeper into the shadow of the Soviet Empire. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, drumming on helmets and shoulders. Steam rose from the soldiers' uniforms as their body heat met the cool Moscow air. It gave the scene a ghostly quality, a living mist that seemed to swallow the line as it moved through the city. Somewhere near Red Square, an orchestra stood ready, but no music was played. Stalin had forbidden it. There was to be no sound but the march itself. No triumphal notes, no applause. Only the slow, merciless rhythm of shame. The crowd's silence was not without meaning. It was the silence of judgment, of endurance. Every Soviet citizen there had lived through hunger, bombings, and fear. They had hidden in basements while sirens wailed above, listened to radio broadcasts of desperate battles, watched neighbors vanish in the night. They had endured everything, and won. To shout, to mock, to cheer would cheapen that victory. Instead, they watched, solemn and unblinking, as the price of war walked past them, flesh and blood, defeated and defanged. A gust of wind tore through the avenue, fluttering the red banners overhead. One prisoner, unable to keep his balance, slipped in the mud and fell. For a brief moment, the crowd stirred. A murmur ran through them. But the man got up again, helped by the soldier beside him, and the line moved on. The guards did not react. There was no cruelty, no spectacle of violence. Only the continuation of the march, as if nothing had happened. The symbolism was too important to be interrupted. Discipline had to be perfect. Humiliation complete. From a distant balcony, a Soviet photographer captured the scene. His camera clicked in rhythm with the march. He knew these images would travel the world. Newspapers would publish them, posters would be made, and people far beyond the Soviet borders would see the Third Reich, once unstoppable, now reduced to dust and despair. For Stalin, this was more than victory. It was narrative proof that his will, his leadership, had broken the unbreakable. Hours turned into half a day. By afternoon, the line of prisoners still stretched far into the horizon. The cobblestones were muddy and streaked with footprints, the smell of damp wool and sweat hanging heavy in the air. Behind the main column, Soviet soldiers walked silently, ensuring order, rifles gleaming under the weak sun that occasionally broke through the clouds. The entire city seemed to pulse with the slow rhythm of the march, as though Moscow itself were breathing in the spectacle. Somewhere near the end of the route, a group of Soviet soldiers shared quiet glances. They had fought on the front lines. They had seen friends die in the snow, seen villages burned to ashes. One of them, a young corporal, clenched his fists as the Germans passed. He felt the old rage rise again, the urge to spit, to curse. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled, watching them with the same cold detachment as everyone else. Revenge was already served. It didn't need words. By the time the last groups of prisoners passed through, the daylight had begun to fade. The street cleaners followed, washing the mud and footprints away, as though erasing the memory of the invaders from Soviet soil. The water from their hoses mingled with the rain, running in thin streams along the gutters. The spectators slowly dispersed, silent, thoughtful, burdened by what they had witnessed. The city that had been under siege for so long was now host to its enemies' humiliation. A living proof that empires fall, that arrogance turns to ash. When night finally came, the city lights glowed softly on the wet stones. The echoes of boots had faded, replaced by the distant hum of trams and the quiet murmur of people returning home. But the memory lingered. A vision etched into every mind. The sight of those men, stripped of pride and power, marching under Moscow's grey sky, would be remembered for generations. It was not joy that people felt, but closure. The invincible had been brought low. The war was not yet over, but this was justice. And somewhere in the distance, The Kremlin towers stood like sentinels over history, their red stars shining faintly through the night mist, bearing silent witness to a moment that would never be forgotten. For Stalin, the parade was not merely an act of triumph. It was a calculated symphony of power. Nothing about that day was spontaneous, not even the silence. Every detail had been rehearsed, planned, and approved in advance. This was theater, and Stalin was the unseen director, orchestrating an image that would echo through history. To the Soviet leader, victory was not enough. It had to be seen. It had to be felt, not only by his people but by the entire world watching beyond the Iron Curtain. Moscow itself had been prepared like a stage. The streets along the route were washed and swept, every broken stone replaced. Flags and banners were hung with military precision, their bright crimson hues stark against the grey backdrop of a war-torn city. Slogans of victory were painted across walls in thick black letters, and portraits of Stalin loomed over the route, framed with wreaths and ribbons. But there would be no music, no cheers, no fanfare. This was not a celebration. It was a message carved in silence. The absence of noise made the spectacle all the more haunting, as though the city itself held its breath. The prisoners had been chosen carefully. They were not just soldiers, they were symbols. Entire divisions captured in Belarus and Ukraine had been brought to Moscow to participate, their fate sealed long before the parade began. They were marched through the city's gates not as men, but as instruments of propaganda. The Soviets called it Operation the Great Waltz, a darkly poetic title for a pageant of humiliation. At the head of the line were generals and officers, stripped of their decorations, followed by infantrymen, tank drivers and engineers. Each column represented the might of the German army, now reduced to a weary, beaten shadow. The planning had begun weeks before. Soviet commanders were given explicit instructions from the NKVD: no disorder, no confrontation, no cruelty. The world would be watching, and the parade must appear disciplined, controlled, an image of civilization triumphing over barbarity. Stalin wanted no mob justice. He wanted order. Even vengeance, in his eyes, had to serve a political purpose. So soldiers were stationed at every intersection, not to harm the prisoners, but to maintain perfect formation. And behind the last ranks of Germans, a line of Soviet sanitation workers stood ready with hoses and brooms. When the last prisoner passed, they would follow, washing the streets clean of the enemy's footprints. The symbolism was brutal, poetic, and absolute. From his office in the Kremlin, Stalin watched reports come in. He did not need to see the parade in person. He understood its power better than anyone. The very idea of it was enough, a living image of the Red Army's revenge, a national ritual of purification. For years, his people had endured unimaginable suffering. They had seen their cities burned, their fields scorched, their families torn apart. Now, they would see the men responsible humbled in the dust. And more importantly, they would see him, Stalin, as the architect of that justice. Propaganda officers had been dispatched across the city days in advance. They briefed citizens on how to behave: no shouting, no clapping, no throwing objects. The Soviet Union was not a mob, it was an empire of discipline. The people's silence, they said, would be their applause. The silence would speak louder than any cheer. And indeed, when the day came, that silence carried the weight of centuries. It was the stillness of a nation that had suffered and survived. The Germans could feel the eyes on them as they marched. Not just the eyes of the living, but of the dead. Every shattered building, every bullet, scarred wall seemed to stare back at them, accusingly. To the prisoners, it was not a parade but a funeral procession. Their own. They walked past posters that read, "They came to destroy. Now they march in shame." Some tried not to look, others glanced up briefly, and then back down again, ashamed. They knew what they represented, not individuals, but defeat itself. The Soviets had arranged the parade route with deliberate symbolism. It passed by major landmarks, the site of Stalin's speeches, the theaters of propaganda, the buildings that had survived German bombing raids. The choice of Gorky Street was not random. It was long, wide, and central, the artery of the city, lined with factories, offices, and residential buildings filled with workers who had rebuilt Moscow after its near fall. Now those same workers stood on the sidewalks, watching the invaders who once vowed to annihilate them. Street photographers moved along the edges, capturing the moment from every angle. Some of them used old German cameras seized from the front lines. The irony was not lost on them. Nazi technology now recording Nazi humiliation. Their photos would soon fill Soviet newspapers, displayed on walls, printed in pamphlets, and broadcast across the radio waves. The headlines were already written. They marched proudly through Europe. Now they crawl through Moscow. The parade was not just for Moscow's eyes. It was for the world's judgment. The silence was heavier than any shout. Even foreign correspondents who had been invited to witness the event described it later as eerily solemn. There were no cries of anger or vengeance from the crowd. The discipline was almost supernatural. The sound of boots striking stone echoed between the buildings, multiplying into a hollow, endless rhythm. That was all anyone heard. The relentless march of defeat. It was as if the city itself had become a living drum, beating to the rhythm of fallen empires. As the prisoners turned a corner, they saw massive banners with the portraits of Soviet heroes, soldiers who had died defending Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad. Their faces, drawn in bold red and black, stared down like gods of vengeance. The Germans avoided their gaze, but the message was unmistakable. You took everything from us. Now we take everything from you. The balance of power had shifted. The empire that once stood unshakable was now paraded through the ruins of its own arrogance. When the rain began again, it fell gently at first, then harder, washing away the dust and sweat from the prisoners' faces. The Soviet sanitation crews, waiting behind the last ranks, began their work. Streams of water flowed across the cobblestones, mixing with mud and footprints. It was a cleansing ritual, both literal and symbolic. As the prisoners moved forward, the water erased their traces. By the time the next group arrived, the street was spotless again. The act was chillingly deliberate, a visual representation of the Soviet wish to wipe out all memory of the invader. Behind the crowds, on rooftops and balconies, stood Soviet officers and NKVD agents observing every movement. They were not there to protect the prisoners, but to protect the image. No one would be allowed to interfere, no one permitted to disrupt the scene. Stalin's vision of order had to be absolute. Even the emotions of his people were to be choreographed. To the dictator, propaganda was not lies. It was art, sculpted truth. This parade was his masterpiece, and it worked. The people who witnessed it never forgot. Some said they felt a weight lift from their hearts that day, as though years of fear had finally been repaid in justice. Others said they went home in silence, unsure how to feel. The enemy had been defeated, but the sight of so many broken men, stripped of humanity, left them uneasy. The moral lines blurred between vengeance and cruelty, between justice and spectacle. But Stalin did not care for moral lines. What mattered was power, and power required image. The foreign journalists who reported on the parade sent their stories around the world. In London, New York, and Paris, newspapers carried photographs of the endless columns of German soldiers trudging through Moscow. Some readers saw justice, others saw barbarity. But everyone understood the message: the Red Army was unstoppable. The Soviet Union had not only survived, it had humiliated the mightiest army in Europe. In Berlin, Goebbels received the reports and raged. He called it a grotesque farce, a Soviet perversion of victory. But even he could not deny its impact. The sight of German soldiers walking in shame through Moscow was devastating to morale. It destroyed the illusion of invincibility that had sustained the Reich for years. The propaganda machine in Germany scrambled to suppress the images, but whispers spread. Soldiers at the front heard rumors of the parade, of entire divisions captured and displayed like cattle. It was not just a humiliation. It was psychological warfare at its finest. Stalin's genius lay in understanding that victory was not just about battlefields. It was about narrative. A victory unseen was a victory wasted. The march of prisoners through Moscow was a message not only to the Allies, but to his own people: you suffered for me. Now see what I have done for you. It reinforced his image as the father of the nation, the unbreakable leader who had delivered vengeance through strength. Every photograph, every headline, every whispered retelling served that purpose. When the parade ended, and the last prisoner had disappeared beyond the city's edge, the street cleaners finished their task. The hoses hissed, the water ran clear, and the cobblestones shone under the weak evening light. The streets looked untouched, as if the entire event had been an illusion. But the memory was indelible. The image of those broken men, marching beneath Stalin's looming portraits, became one of the most haunting scenes of the 20th century. Even decades later, historians would debate the morality of it. Was it justice, or cruelty disguised as ceremony? Yet in Stalin's mind, such questions were meaningless. History was not written in fairness, but in dominance. The parade was his declaration that the Soviet Union had not only survived the onslaught, it had conquered it. The shame of the prisoners became the pride of the victors, and as the last drops of rain fell upon the empty streets, Moscow stood reborn, cleansed, vengeful, silent. The footprints of the enemy had been washed away, but the sound of their boots would echo forever in the memory of a nation. When the final ranks of prisoners disappeared beyond the distant horizon, a strange and almost sacred silence fell over Moscow. The rhythmic thunder of boots that had filled the streets for hours had ceased. What remained was an emptiness, a silence heavy enough to be felt in the chest, as if the entire city exhaled for the first time in years. The people who had stood shoulder to shoulder for most of the day now began to disperse slowly, as though afraid that moving too quickly might disturb the fragile stillness that lingered. The rain had returned, light and cold, painting silver streaks across the red flags that hung limp and wet over the streets. The day of humiliation was over. But what it left behind was something far deeper than spectacle. It was the echo of history itself. The city that had once feared annihilation now stood witness to its own vindication. Moscow, which had been bombed, starved, and nearly surrounded in the dark days of 1941, was now the stage of ultimate retribution. And yet there was no cheering, no laughter, no dancing in the streets. The people had expected triumph to feel different, louder, more joyous, perhaps even intoxicating. but instead it felt somber. The Germans were gone, but their shadows remained, cast long and cold over the wet cobblestones. It was as if their shame had soaked into the streets themselves. Some of the crowd lingered long after the last prisoner vanished. They stood under the soft drizzle, gazing down the empty avenue where the defeated had marched. They had waited 3 long years for this day, through nights of hunger, terror, and grief. They had buried their sons and brothers in frozen soil, written letters that never reached the front, and worked themselves to exhaustion in factories that never slept. They had dreamt of this moment, of seeing justice, but now that it had come, it felt like staring at a grave. An old soldier, his arm in a sling, remained motionless as others around him drifted away. His eyes followed the direction of the vanished column. He had fought at Stalingrad, seen entire battalions swallowed by the snow, watched friends die for inches of ground. Now he had seen those same enemies broken, marching under the same grey sky, yet, even as a victor, he could not feel pride. He whispered something only he could hear. A name, perhaps, or a prayer, before turning to leave. The rain washed down his face, hiding the tears that had begun to form. Not far from where he stood, a group of children splashed in the puddles left behind by the march. They laughed quietly, their voices echoing faintly through the empty street. Their mothers quickly hushed them, not in anger, but in reverence. This was not a day for joy. Even the innocent laughter of children felt misplaced in the aftermath of such a scene. The adults looked at one another, uncertain of what they were supposed to feel: triumph, relief, pity, or fatigue. Perhaps all of them at once. The emotional weight of the war had not vanished with the parade. If anything, it had grown heavier now that the enemy was human again, stripped of his monstrous mask, revealed as flesh and bone. As night fell, the rain intensified. The streetlights came alive one by one, casting shimmering reflections across the puddles that lined the boulevards. The city glowed faintly under the mist, its wet stones shining like glass. Street cleaners continued their work, hosing down the final sections of the road, sweeping away debris, and erasing the muddy tracks left behind. The act carried a solemn symbolism, one that everyone understood without needing words. The invaders had walked these streets, and now their presence was being washed away, erased from Moscow's memory. Only the water and the faint smell of damp earth remained. In the distance, the bells of a church began to toll. Their slow, measured tones echoed across the rooftops, mingling with the rain and the fading murmurs of the departing crowd. It was a haunting sound, not joyous, not mournful, but deeply final. It felt like the closing of a chapter, the last toll for the millions who had fallen since the invasion began. For every Soviet mother who had waited by a window, for every soldier who had frozen to death on the steppe, for every village burned to ash. This sound was their requiem. Somewhere deep inside the Kremlin, Stalin received the final report: the parade had concluded without incident. Everything had gone according to plan. The foreign journalists had taken their notes, the photographers had captured their images, and the message had been sent. But Stalin was not celebrating. He sat quietly at his desk, a cigarette burning between his fingers, staring at a large map of Europe. His eyes traced the black line that marked the German advance from 1941, and the red arrows that showed their retreat. The march had been a symbolic victory, but the war itself was not yet finished. He knew that thousands of those prisoners would never return home, that most would die in camps scattered across the Soviet Union. Yet even their deaths would serve a purpose, a reminder that no one challenges the empire without consequence. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Somewhere beyond the city, the defeated German soldiers were being herded toward the trains that would carry them eastward. They were soaked, exhausted, and silent. Some coughed blood. Others limped barefoot through the mud. They had walked through the Soviet capital as living trophies, and now they were being sent to disappear into the vast unknown, to the camps of Siberia, to the frozen quarries and mines where survival was measured not in months, but in days. Few of them would ever see Germany again. The walk of shame through Moscow had merely been the beginning of their long descent into oblivion. For those left behind in the city, the images of the day refused to fade. In the coming weeks, newspapers would publish photographs of the parade, and propaganda posters would declare it a symbol of Soviet justice. But the people who had been there knew the truth. What they had witnessed was not victory alone, but the raw aftermath of human ruin. The enemy had been humiliated, but at what cost? The destruction that had swept across the land could never truly be washed away. The burned villages, the unmarked graves, the children orphaned by war, those scars would outlast the memory of the parade. As the days passed, life in Moscow resumed its routine rhythm. Factories roared back to life, trains whistled through the stations, and soldiers prepared for the final push toward Berlin. But under the surface, something had changed. The people carried with them the memory of that strange, silent day. The day they saw the war's human face. The image of thousands of defeated men marching through the rain haunted their dreams. It was not a scene of triumph but of reckoning, a reminder that even victory has its ghosts. Artists began to paint it. Writers began to describe it. Some called it the day of justice, others the day of shame. But one theme ran through every telling. It was a day when the conquerors became the conquered. When arrogance met its end, when the once mighty German war machine was reduced to a weary line of men under grey skies. For decades after the war, the photographs would resurface, black and white, grainy, haunting. The faces of the prisoners, the puddled streets, the silent onlookers. Each image spoke volumes about power, pride, and the fragility of all things human. The red square that night was empty. The rain had washed it clean, and the red flags, heavy with water, drooped against their poles. The Kremlin's red stars glowed faintly through the mist, their light reflecting off the slick pavement below. A faint smell of wet stone and gunpowder hung in the air, the scent of a city that had outlasted death. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. Moscow existed only in that silence, suspended between war and peace, between vengeance and memory. In a small apartment near the parade route, a woman lit a candle before an old photograph of her husband. He had died in the defense of the city 3 years earlier. She had stood among the crowd that morning and watched the prisoners march past. Now, in the flickering candlelight, she whispered his name. "You see," she murmured, "they came and they fell. You did not die for nothing." But even as she said the words, her voice trembled. The victory she had waited for did not fill the emptiness beside her bed. The silence of her apartment echoed the silence of the streets. Elsewhere, a soldier sat by a window, staring at the rain. He had been one of the guards that day. He remembered the faces of the Germans, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands. He should have felt satisfaction, perhaps even joy. But all he felt was a strange pity. They had been enemies, yes, but now they were simply men, defeated, lost, and far from home. The war had stripped them of everything, just as it had stripped him. He looked down at the medals pinned to his chest and wondered if they truly meant anything anymore. The parade was over, but it had not ended. It continued to march in the minds of those who saw it. It became part of the city's legend, whispered in stories, remembered in silence. It was both a warning and a promise. A warning to future enemies of what awaited them, and a promise to the people that their suffering would never be forgotten. But history, as it often does, would twist and reshape the memory. Decades later, it would be called by many names. The March of the Vanquished, the Procession of the Dead, the Walk of Shame. Yet its essence remained the same. It was the day Moscow showed the world that pride, no matter how vast, eventually kneels. As midnight approached, the rain finally began to ease. The air grew still, and the reflections in the puddles dimmed as the streetlights flickered out one by one. The city slept, but not peacefully. The ghosts of the day lingered in the alleys, in the echoes of footsteps, in the whispered memories of those who had seen it all. Moscow had been cleansed, but not purified. It had seen justice, but not mercy. The next morning, when the sun rose weakly over the city, the streets were spotless. There was no sign of the parade, no footprints, no mud, no trace of the thousands who had passed through. Only the faint memory of their march remained, hanging in the air like mist. The people went about their day, pretending nothing had changed, but deep down, they knew that something profound had shifted. They had looked into the face of their enemy and seen not monsters, but men. And in that reflection, they saw themselves weary, scarred, and desperate to survive. The parade had been Stalin's masterpiece, but it belonged to the people now. It was part of their collective memory, a scar carved into their souls. For some it was justice, for others it was sorrow. But for all it was truth, a truth that could not be erased, even as the water from the street cleaners carried away the last traces of the enemy's march.